Hello, everyone. Uh, Welcome to another episode of our Zero Green Design podcast. Today we have with us Natalie Douglas, and I will make an introduction about Natalie later on, but I wanted to start with a direct question about she's based in Canada and she was born in Canada. She's Canadian, studied in Canada, and we are publishing a lot of papers and case studies, and we talk to a lot of people that come from Canada. So I would like to ask her what's going on there, why sustainability is so relevant in Canada. Welcome, Natalie.
Thank you so much, Juan. I do believe that Canada is actually not all that progressive if you look at some of our target reaching in a lot of ways, at least on a federal and provincial level. But I think if you look at cities and the individuals working on projects, we have a really good education system. And largely speaking, I think that a lot of the work that Canadians are doing right now is very collaborative. There's a lot of information sharing. I do also think that the identity piece of Canada brings up something interesting to the table, which is that as a country, I think we have this captivation and love, and it's part of our national identity to love the natural environment and be really grateful for all that we have. But at the same time, we have this tension of we are definitely a country of overconsumption. And I think there's a lot of guilt there, at least in sustainability professionals. And so I think that all those things come together to hopefully produce a lot of good content.
Mhm.
That's my take on it, at least.
Okay, that's interesting. And you mentioned a couple of things. We'll elaborate a bit and more when further in our conversation. But when we first knew about you, might have been a couple of years ago, I think, and we read about your work in the city of Nelson, which is a relatively small city. Could you tell us a bit more about city of Nelson, how you ended up there, and how you started doing that work there? That I think has been a really good example and has been used as a case study in Canada and internationally as well.
Sure thing. The city of Nelson, to offer some context, is an open-minded community. They have a history of pushing ahead on a lot of things and certainly punching above its weight class in on environmental topics. And so I came into that space with a lot of enthusiasm to do really good work, but it also was an environment that was ripe for this type of project. So in the city of Nelson, the project was called the Low Carbon Homes Pilot. And there was already work being done on the topic of embodied emissions, reducing embodied emissions, when I arrived, but it hadn't been scaled up. It was kind of a side of desk type of work. And it just was quite serendipitous that I came in and I had a background looking at consumption-based emissions. I felt very passionately about addressing embodied emissions and materials, reducing emissions associated with material use. And so those things all came together to create a really good environment to innovate on the topic. And so we got grant funding from a large utility in BC, Fortis BC, and we started working with a lot of different people across the country. Most importantly, Chris Magwood from Builders for Climate Action. We got connected with him pretty early on, and I think that helped elevate the work that we did quite a lot. We didn't have the reach that Chris did, and when we worked with him on the document that we created back in 2021, 2022, I think it was published in 2022, the Material Carbon Emissions Guide, that was definitely bolstered because we had worked with Chris. And so connections and relationships mean a lot, especially when you're talking about a small community that can be doing a lot of work, but they're not front of mind to a lot of places. I think there are a lot of communities that are actually doing really great work, but they don't actually get elevated because no one knows it's happening. There's a township, actually, township of Duro-Dummer in Ontario, so Eastern Canada. And they actually worked with Chris Magwood as well and Builders for Climate Action. And they were one of the first communities in North America to develop a regulation on embodied carbon, or rather an incentive type program, where if you hit under a certain amount of embodied carbon on a new project, you had reduced permitting fees. And that was one of the first in North America, and it was a population of 7,000 people. So Nelson, the first, but we did have a history of this work. We had a really energetic, great community of builders, and we had the leverage of being able to work with Chris Megwood and the awesome team at Builders for Climate Action, as well as a lovely community of folks at Carbon Leadership Forum in Washington, and all the hubs across the country. So we had a lot of support. And I think we're going to talk about this a little bit more later on, but how much information sharing allowed Nelson to succeed.
And I think it's an important part as well, the people locally, all the stakeholders engage during the process, because if you talk to all these people you mentioned earlier, it's important, but also the people on the ground in the city that have to build the manufacturers of the products. How was that process, and how did you engage with them to pass that message and communicate that message on embodied carbon and sustainability in general?
Well, from the very beginning, I knew that they were absolutely integral to the process. I have a lot of work experience in community engagement. My background is in urban planning, city planning, and I knew that policies are only as effective as the folks that are implementing it. And so right off the bat, we understood that the practitioners are the ones we need to get buy-in from. And both luckily and unluckily, I came into Nelson around the pandemic. Like, it was late 2020, early 2021. And so on one side, we were limited in not being able to do as many engagements and bringing people together in person. But on the other end, it allowed us to take a little bit more time being very intentional with how we reach out to people, how to bring folks together, who are the people that we need at the table. And then once we were able to meet, there was such an appetite for folks to share information. Everyone wanted to talk to each other. Everyone wanted to be in the same room. They wanted to do socials. They missed each other. And so I think that really worked in our favor, that we set up an embodied carbon advisory group. And we had people that had traditionally not been involved in the sphere of reducing emissions come, and through a year and a half of coming together, it proved extraordinarily helpful in moving the dial. Again, Nelson certainly is a place that is an example of the importance of education and collaboration. We are not a prime example of developing, legislation or regulation or policy. We don't have the capacity that maybe the city of Toronto and city of Vancouver does. And so we had to be very intentional with how can we build capacity up so this can be a long-term endeavor. And, some of the folks that came to the advisory group, it was beautiful to be able to see them do such impressive work. And I just created the space. So much of it is them talking to each other, making sure they have the right context, making sure they understand where to get reputable data and how maybe they can change their own practices. We had, some folks working in the concrete sector that had not previously been engaged and felt empowered to do anything. And once we got them on board, they did some really, really impactful work. So yeah, coming back to your initial question.
I think that's really good to hear, and I think that collaboration, that again, we've talked about it already twice at least, but there is something else. What you mentioned about education, and also about regulations and larger cities. So maybe the scale of a city like Nelson allowed for that collaboration that might be more difficult in larger cities like Toronto, Vancouver, or elsewhere around across the world. So how do you see that relationship between education and regulation, and a balance between both of them?
I think that whenever I talk to other folks in municipalities and those wanting to develop embodied carbon initiatives, I say, find your strong points. You're going to have different strengths than other communities, and you have to make sure that you are elevating the folks that are leading already. You're leaning on all the strengths that your community already has. Exactly what you said. Small communities have the asset of being a small community. You can connect with almost everyone in the community. That's amazing. That is not possible in Vancouver, in a lot of big cities. That might not be where they innovate. I think the role that Nelson and many other small communities can play is, how do we test really nimble, quick pilot projects? Because you can do that. You know a lot of people in the environment. You can bring in specialists quite easily because there's one in the community or two in the community. I think that testing projects end up being quite helpful in small communities, and you can learn really well what educational programs might be possible, what is needed. And so I think that that is a strength of the small community leading on the topic of embodied emissions and what they can contribute to the field. Whereas the City of Vancouver and City of Toronto, they have the capacity and staff to engage with it's not like they don't engage with their building community. It's just a different type of relationship. They build really great regulation and writing that then small communities can copy and adapt. And I think that together we offer each other really good support about how we can move forward on embodied carbon. Because I definitely am not under the belief, I do not believe that we are only going to reduce emissions by bottom up approaches that entail education, right? I think there is a role absolutely to play in the regulatory space. I think when we're talking about embodied emissions, which is obviously what we focused on in the project that I was involved in Nelson, so much of that has to do with processes that a small municipality are not involved in. So when we got to how do we move the needle on changing things in reducing the amount of embodied emissions, we talk about materials. And then we go back to, okay, well, can the federal government institute a policy that certain types of materials, they wouldn't be able to go beyond a certain threshold of emissions intensity when they're producing it? I think that insulation is always a good example, that Canada put in a regulation so the type of XPS foam became a lot less emissive after that regulation came into place, because it forced manufacturers to change their formulas. That's not something that necessarily a small community can do, and that's not something that we can ask the building community necessarily to change. I think there are these structural changes that are absolutely needed in tandem to the capacity building piece and to the regulatory and policy work that we do.
That's a very good response. And to elaborate a bit more on the collaboration and the sharing, there is something we have noticed since we started with Zero Green Design, is that people really want to share. And that's why when we started, we had the hope that it would be like that. But you see more and more of that. And it's something that happens a lot in this environment. And we meet a lot of people all around the world, and they are happy to share their work. And sometimes, often they feel, like it's they are proud that we are sharing their work that otherwise would be in shelves, or it would be only, when you talk about papers, for example, work that would be just for experts in the topic, and it's so they feel happy about it. So why do you think that's happening more in that sustainability? So instead of people holding their cards and all their knowledge, it's more like, guys, I've done this, why don't you try that? And it's about sharing and then getting and changing, because the industry is changing very quickly, isn't it? So it's about sharing and then learning more and then growing altogether, isn't it?
I think that there's no one answer to that, but my experience in the field is that in the world of reducing emissions and addressing climate change, there's a lot of climate anxiety. There are a lot of folks that feel very passionately about the work that we do, and it feels like there's no real justification for protecting some of this information, that if I can't solve this problem, like maybe you can. And I think there is this spirit of collaboration because we are on such a wild timeline for needing to reduce emissions and act ambitiously and seriously on climate change that there's just definitely an encouragement of working together and sharing information that maybe wasn't there before. Maybe that priority was not there before. There also is tools to work together, I think, that are available now that maybe weren't as prevalent before. Like we can share massive amounts of
True.
data in a way that not like you're going to send a book to, Dublin from Vancouver. Maybe that was a while ago, but I do think that
Yeah.
massive amounts of data sharing is much more possible now than it ever was before. And I think that on an individual level, people just naturally want to talk through the stresses of their life and like how they're encountering a problem, and they want to talk back and forth about these problems. And so maybe on an organizational level, the sharing within private organizations might still be a little hesitant, but I'd say largely speaking in the climate world, all of us have this shared sense of urgency. And I think that that really helps with
Yeah.
the data sharing that happens.
I agree with that as well. So, could you tell us a bit, now that you've talked already a lot, I think, about what you have been doing? So, a bit on your background. What did you study? How did you said you talk already about how you arrived to the city of Nelson, but a bit of your background, what you studied, your work in Nelson, you've already talked about it, and what you're working on now?
Sure. So I have an undergraduate degree in environmental science and urban design, and then my master's was in urban planning. I don't have a particularly linear work path, but I've always, all the way through, I've always really cared about climate change and working to mitigating its effects. And I think that in grad school, not to be dramatic, but finding out about the concept of scope 3 emissions and consumption-based emissions just made so much of my worldview make sense. I think I struggled to properly communicate what I felt was missing from the conversation. I didn't understand why some things didn't make sense to me, and I think that just that idea that not addressing, operational emissions without thinking about embodied emissions, without thinking about consumption, didn't make sense to me. And so when I was exposed to that concept, it started to move a lot of things that had just been in the background to the forefront of my work. And yeah, so I definitely have a lot of work experience in community engagement and data analysis and working in different fields. But when I found that concept, I was deeply impassioned to start to think about, okay, how does this change the way I look at our cities? I'm a city planner. I like seeing the spaces between buildings, not just the
Mhm.
buildings. And how does understanding embodied emissions and the emissions impacts of our material choices, how does that change how I see planning in a city? And unfortunately, I don't have a clear answer for exactly, how what the answer is for all of our communities to do a better job, but I'm working on that. And now where I'm at in Vancouver, I work as a Zero Emissions Building Exchange program manager, otherwise known as ZEBx. And the work that I do in a practical sense is quite similar to what I did in Nelson in that I work with industry and I work with the public sector. Instead of being part of the public sector, I'm now in a not-for-profit, whereas in Nelson, I worked for the city there. And so here in Vancouver, I am very focused on pushing forward building decarbonization. And that often involves getting folks from the, you know, private sphere to communicate clearly with the public sphere and vice versa. And so my varied background, I think, is very helpful to what I do now. Planners generally are a profession that is all about getting people together. As I said previously, we're often obsessed with the spaces between things, like where are the connections happening? How does this work together long term, short term? So yeah, I'm not a practicing planner. I don't work on project by project buildings, but I do think that in the position that I'm in now, it makes a lot of sense looking at all the things that I've done in my career so far.
And I think that that's also because you have that holistic approach that you see it's not only the building, and that's something maybe we don't discuss enough, which is everything that happens between buildings. There is a lot of work and research about the buildings, but not as much on what's happening in all those spaces that you were talking about. So why do you think that's happening? Why? Because we have urban designers and we have cities that look after the urban design, but still there is a lot of focus on the building. How do you think that could be improved? Or would you know of good examples where that's at city scale, those things are happening, and and that urban design is approached both from a operational carbon point of view and embodied carbon?
Well, I think there's always space to expand the definition even further. And unfortunately, I don't know if I have like a perfect city example for a place that has integrated consideration of embodied emissions, operational emissions, resilience, comfort, well-being, accessibility, absolutely everything under the sun, and done it exquisitely. I am in Vancouver, and to be quite frank, I am impressed with the work that they do. The A position was recently posted, and um, it was an embodied carbon planner position. And I have not seen that type of role anywhere else in North America. I'm sure it's happening, but it's not as common, is all I'm saying. And so I do think that places like Vancouver have done a decently good job at starting to confront the complexity. Has any one place done a perfect job about integrating it on every project in every part of their city? Probably not. But I do think that there has been a shift in the past 2 years or so about the importance of overlapping well-being and comfort and resilience, and building a really compelling pitch for why addressing climate change is not just a carbon checkbox, but it's a transformative, hopeful action. I think we have to have a compelling pitch for why people should change the way they do things.
Mhm.
Right. And so I do think that we're starting to see communities work with landscape architects and planners and engineers and start to think and utility companies, and think about how do all these things come together in a way that we can bring a really high quality of life to a lot of different people. And this is not a master planning exercise in most contexts. This is a retrofitting example. Like, this is cities exist, and we have to adapt them in a way that doesn't rip out communities and existing connections, but we have to adapt them in ways that serve us and our natural environment better.
Mhm. And I think that all makes sense. And you said something about carbon, that it's not only about carbon. So for many years, the construction industry was focused on the operational carbon, and we were focusing on, and we left everything behind, and we didn't talk about embodied carbon. In the last number of years, depends on what region of the world, 5, 10, 7, 2, depending, there was a shift towards embodied carbon. But more recently, that view of the problem is much wider. So as you said, it's biodiversity, and it's circular economy that's becoming very important as well. So it's for a long time there was just focus on one thing. Then we look at embodied, and now suddenly there are so many things we are looking at that they are all as important than carbon. And then how is that in your new role? How is that approach at a city level, taking into account how do you work with your team, for example? Are there experts that look at each of them, or is a few people that look at different issues, like yourself, for example? Do you look at embodied carbon and operational and biodiversity, or you have other colleagues that look at those topics?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the organization that I work for is called the Zero Emissions Innovation Center. I specifically manage the program called the Zero Emissions Building Exchange. So the work that I do is often connecting different projects. So within ZEBx, the Zero Emissions Innovation Center, there is a program area focused on electrification. There's one focused on accelerating retrofits. There is one focused on embodied emissions. And ZEBx is oftentimes and increasingly going through a transitional period right now where we're trying to figure out how can we bring these together in a way that doesn't overwhelm municipalities and is a feasible, especially financially, a feasible way of moving forward. How do we integrate all of these things together without overcomplicating processes? I think embodied carbon is a very good example of, in Nelson, a lot of the work that we did was not rocket science. It is not rocket science. People do understand the concept of
Yeah.
embodied carbon quite easily. We have a lot of jargon to make it more complicated, but it really is not that complicated. If you start to talk about there being a cost or an emissions cost to manufacturing goods, people get that. They're like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
I definitely think about that. I think about where I purchased something, how far it had to go. I think about, the processes involved in developing or creating something. Like it's intuitive to a lot of people. And so I do think that our the need that we have to, address is involving and synthesizing and sitting with a lot of complexity and building systems that we can absorb all that complexity and then translate it into something that is not more complex, that is actually simpler or easier to work with and adaptable. And that is no small task, but I definitely do think that for a lot of years, we have added policies, we've added bylaws, we've added considerations, and it hasn't resulted in the outcomes that we really want. It just ends up making people frustrated with process. They say, I have to do X amount of reports, I have to submit a whole bunch of paperwork. And I think that as a organization, ZEBx, or a program area, I should say, ZEBx might have this role to play in connecting industry and public institutions and figuring out how do we do this balancing act in a way that feels right to our ambitions. Because we're some things are likely going to have to be weighed more importantly than others in certain projects, and that might be appropriate.
Mhm.
We can't allow the complexity, though, for us to completely give up and be like, we're going completely operational emissions only because material emissions and embodied emissions is too complicated to address. That cannot be, the outcome. The complexity cannot lead us to just give up. It needs to come to a place where it is genuinely feasible for us to work on projects and integrate complexity into those projects. And check
And
back
can you, sorry,
in if I have a solution for you.
and how you think, because all that you're talking about is very much related to education again. So how can that the industry feed back into academia, starting even not only university, but even secondary schools, primary schools? So that's something that children start growing and thinking. So if that's in their mindset, it would be much easier when they reach adulthood. So are you working? Are you engaging with any university? Are you doing any work on that front, or do you know about any program that would help with that?
Yeah, I Zeek itself is not one focused on educating secondary students or we don't have a history yet. We're a pretty new organization, but we don't have any history of working on projects explicitly with our universities. But I will say that BC and Metro Vancouver has a long history of a lot of work in that area, and there are a lot of great organizations working on building up climate education in schools and collaboration between municipalities and university students at UBC or SFU, Simon Fraser, and University of British Columbia. There are certainly examples. I know even in Nelson, a lot of the work that we did was also focused on getting into trade schools, getting into building up educational services for building officials. So these are the folks on the ground analyzing buildings, examining them for safety. They are the folks interacting with it in practice. And I think that those are the people that currently in the industry we have not focused on enough. We have a lot of architects on board, we have a lot of engineers on board, and those folks are very involved with larger buildings, but smaller buildings tend to be building designers, sometimes architects, and contractors and tradespeople. And that group of individuals have been incredibly busy. There's been a lot of change, and there hasn't been a history of coordinated education connected with climate and empowering these folks to come up with really great solutions. So I think that there is absolutely a role to play in continuing to educate young folks, elementary, high school, as well as university. But I think Canada is actually doing that pretty well. Whereas I think that there's still a lot of growth in making sure that climate change and addressing it isn't this academic pursuit and elitist and ivory tower-esque. This is something that everyone can engage with. And I think that ZEBx has done a really good job. We are connected to a technical institute, British Columbia Institute of Technology, BCIT, and they were actually the organization with Athena that developed the first life cycle assessment micro-credential. And so this technical school has a history of innovating in this front, and they're doing a really good job of trying to build in how do we bring these folks that have historically not been as involved in this work and bring them up and make them feel empowered to take this on and feel like it's something that won't make their job harder, but it will make it more purposeful, or might even make it easier. I don't know, but like they need to be part of this process in a way that maybe historically they haven't.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good point, because I was focusing on young people. There are many others that haven't been maybe part of the change. Thank you for that. And then before we end, I'd like to ask you, what would you say to all those people that you referred at the beginning that have that carbon anxiety? So some of them would be working on it already. So, but there are many others that don't necessarily have to be professionals in the field, or they might be younger again, or students. What would you say to them, and how you think they could? How can they join the fight against climate change, so they feel part of it, and that help them also to deal with that anxiety about the climate change?
I think that I'm still early in my career, but I would say that what has served me well has been being courageous and sticking to your values. There have been many moments where I have presented, embodied carbon and addressing consumption-based emissions is something we really have to address. And having a lot of pushback, having folks say it doesn't completely relate to planning, or there's not enough evidence to suggest. And I think that if you feel very, very strongly, and I don't mean just on a whim, but I mean, if you've done your research and you feel really, really strongly that this is something that people should be addressing, and this process or topic or whatever is your passion is part of working on climate change, push hard on it. Be courageous in having your voice heard. Be open to being wrong about things, absolutely, but really be courageous in sticking to your values in how it relates to working on climate change. And the other one is like, be kind. It might be cliche, but like, be kind to people. This is a space that a lot of people are stressed out. They might be coming from very different backgrounds that you. Just be kind, be collaborative. It will serve you well. I really, to my core, do not believe that you have to push others down to, succeed. And I think that being kind, you are going to have folks that just want to be around you, and they want to work together, and that is going to serve you long term, and it's going to serve our planet long term.
I think that's a really good piece of advice and a good way to finish this conversation today. So thank you very much again, Natalie, for being with us, and I hope we can collaborate further in the future with other events, because I can see a lot of potential for collaboration here. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.